We also have the dynamic schemas, and we were already a little bit looking at it, but in order to really understand it, we need to go to the OpenAPI specification. So in the OpenAPI specification, let's go to the trigger. So this is the trigger. I believe I'm right. Yeah, so this is the post, and as you can tell, the summary is start dialog. And it is referencing a dialog subscription request. We did not take a look at it just yet, but actually this is the request with the app ID and the intent and the description that we looked at just a minute ago. But you also see here this XMS notification content, and this is the schema for the message that is being sent to the logic app as part of an event that happened within the API. And this is referred to by this dynamic intent schema. So let's could have defined it here directly within the schema, but for reusability and also to make it a little bit more easier to read, so because the schemas can get quite big, we have set it up to be a definition that we can reference at. So let's take a look at this dynamic intent schema. Well, it's of a type object, but this is the most important part. It is of type x-ms-dynamic-schema. And similarly to the dynamic list, we specify the operation ID that is to return the schema that we require. In this particular case, it's a get schema, and just like we saw with the other ones, it's just a regular action. So this is the get schema, and it points to a particular URL with the get, and next to the app ID, this also requires the intent to be part of the action. So in order to be able to get this schema, we need to have the app ID and the intent set. So how do we set the app ID and the intent? Well, we get it from the app ID and the intent. So these are the names for the parameters within the API that we call, and these are the names of the values where we get them from. So in this particular case, it's from the trigger app ID and the trigger intent. So as we set it up for the trigger, and then we tell it where it can find the schema within the response. So that's better just shown. So let me launch Postman so that we can do a trial request to retrieve the schema. And because you need to be authenticated and my token is probably expired, I'm gonna request a new access token. I need to approve. There we go. And there's our token. And now we can actually request. So we're going to request a schema for the customer engagement manager schema intent. And this is what it returns. So it returns the schema, which is this thing. This is a JSON schema, and I'm using Newtonsoft's JSON JSchema to create the schema. But it's a regular JSON schema with some sprinkles of the Microsoft Custom Connector extensions, for example, the visibility. And I've wrapped it in the schema root. And this is something to be aware of. You do not necessarily need to wrap it in a root node as part of the documentation. They tell you that if you do not specify this value path, it will take your schema from the root of the response. But somehow that didn't read the schema as a schema, but it will interpret the values to be the schema. So I would get schema values named title, description, type, all those things, instead of a property named user principal name. So as soon as I wrapped it in the schema, or it doesn't really matter what you name it, as long as you wrap it in a root node, and add this value path, then it will actually interpret it as a schema. And you can tell that, for example, if we look at the code that we have created, it's creating a root schema, and it's adding these default properties, UPN, text, and the conversation reference. But if we have a Lewis service found, then we are trying to add the intents. So we add a intents node, and for we retrieve, should rename it to entities. It's not intents, so we need to fix that in a bit. It will retrieve all the entities from Lewis using the authoring API again. And then it will add properties for all of these intents, with a description of the name intent, because it should not read entity. This correct entity, it should not be named intents here. And therefore, if we look at this schema, you notice that we have this additional block here. But for example, if we were to load the schema for demo, which is the other intent that we have, you notice that it does not have any entities here. So this is how the dynamic schema works, which is pretty great, and you can do awesome stuff with it and make it your users much easier to work with your API. It takes a little bit of getting used to how to set it up. It was a bit confusing at first for me, but you just start small, return some static values, and see how your API responds to it. Yeah, and it's actually pretty cool once you have set it up, like you saw in my case.